Hello, everyone. Welcome to Womb to Tomb Apologetics. Today, I have a fantastic guest with us, Katy Faust of Them Before Us, here to talk about IVF and surrogacy ethics. So, welcome, Katy. Why
Thank
don't
you.
you just give us a quick rundown of who you are and what you do?
I'm a middle-aged mom with 4 kids. My husband was the pastor of our church for 14 years, and he just recently made the transition to full-time military chaplain. So I'm in the middle of like that transition. My kids are great. They're all teenagers. I'm a huge, huge fan of kids, parenting, training them up, inculcating a biblical worldview in them. When I look at what's happening in the world, one of my dominant themes in my life is don't touch the kids, leave the kids alone, especially when it comes to my kids, leave my kids alone. So we've raised our kids in Seattle, largely in public school, and you can't come at them. Like, they know how to respond to bad arguments. They can identify lies. They know how to stand firm in their beliefs. So that's kind of one area of passion. Another area of passion I have is when it comes to the cultural, legal, and technological changes happening in the world. I'm very passionate about don't touch the kids, leave the kids alone. So that's what my nonprofit Them Before Us is about, is defending children's fundamental rights, specifically their right to their mother and father. But also I dabble in defending children's right to life and right to innocence and right to an intact body that's unmedicalized because of ideological entrapments that might push them down a path of chemical and surgical dependence for their life. So I'm generally very amicable and easygoing and love to get along with everyone, until you make kids sacrifice for you. And that's where my sort of get behind me Satan moment happens. So we're going to talk a little bit today about reproductive technologies. And that is an area where it's very important for Christians to understand what's happening so they know how to defend children.
All right. So today's topic, as I said, is IVF and kind of just big fertility, as you call it. So it's extremely relevant right now, given some of the recent comments by Trump and Senator Ted Cruz in the United States, following the Dobbs decision and all of this. We have this bill that apparently Senator Ted Cruz is talking about, making uh, surrogacy and IVF this like a fundamental right at the federal level, anyway. And so we have a lot of sinister secrets here that the big fertility industry does not want people to be thinking about. So why don't we just kind of begin with just some of your basic philosophy on children's rights? Tell us about the 3 rights that you say we trample on in our society and this tension between adult desires and children's rights. What is that about?
Well, there's unfortunately a lot of children's rights that we trample on. I tend to summarize it all into 4 primary child rights. And you actually can look at these 4 child rights, and it captures all of the major culture war issues that we're facing today. So, children's right to life, family, mind, and body. Obviously, their right to life is something we're mostly familiar with if we're kind of on the right or in the Christian world. And we've largely applied that to abortion, anti-abortion work, which is right and good and proper, because abortion is the snuffing out of a child's life before they leave the womb. And that's critical. Children's life is also at risk in the world of big fertility. And if you look at the numbers, I actually just published this morning at the Federalist a response to the new Cruz Protect IVF bill that links to some stats that makes it clear that big fertility, by the numbers, actually destroys more embryonic life every year than Planned Parenthood. And so what big fertility does in the world of IVF, that is in vitro fertilization, making babies in glass, what it does is it creates way more children than the intended parents ever plan to implant or raise. And then they just grade them out of existence, select them out of existence, freeze them perpetually, donate surplus babies to research. It's just not a child-friendly process. While 2% of children in this country are born through IVF every year, that's only 3 to 7% of the children that are created through IVF. So it's not an industry primarily about making babies. It is about an industry that designs, discards, donates to research, and destroys babies on the whole. So IVF is not pro-life, unfortunately. It's just not. There might be rare, very slim cases where people have a lot of money and they're able to only create and implant the number of embryos they're intending to raise. None of them get freezed or
Hmm.
eugenically screened out of existence, but that's just not what the industry is as a whole. So protecting children's life is a big part. We have to protect it from both the baby taking industry of abortion and the baby making industry of IVF. We need to protect children's family, that is their right to their mother and father. And that means confronting all of the ways that we are overhauling the nuclear family, from no-fault divorce to promoting modern families to legalizing gay marriage, to all the reproductive technologies, including sperm and egg donation, which always separates children from a genetic parent, from surrogacy, which always separates children from their birth mother, and then a child-centric understanding of adoption. So that's their family that needs to be defended. And then children's mind needs to be defended. They have a right to innocence. Children are not just small forms of adults. They don't have the mental capacity to wade through disturbing, mature, or graphic content. They have to be protected from that. And unfortunately, they are being victimized. Their mind is being abused by a lot of the innocence violating sex ed curriculum, by rampant online pornography use, and even things like drag queen story hour, which is very shocking and disturbing for children. And then their bodies. Children have a right to a body that is not unnecessarily medicalized, that has not been thrown into menopause by cross-sex hormones or forced into infertility through puberty blocking hormones, and where they have not had healthy breasts or genitals removed in the name of transgender surgeries. So really, children are under assault in almost every way that you can think that they can be under assault. And I think it's up to Christians, especially, to defend their life, family, mind, and body.
Yeah, you bring up the trans stuff. It's kind of like the old saying. What is it? If someone has a vegan dog, you know who made that choice. And unfortunately, it's in these cases, it's the parents, the people who are supposed to be protecting the children, that are unfortunately doing the most damage. So tell us, what is the just kind of quick breakdown of what's the difference between adoption and surrogacy? Aren't these kind of similar things? I mean, isn't this no different than just, oh, I'm just adopting another kid? What's the
This is
deal?
a very, very important distinction to make. And it really is illustrated by the main dividing line that we use at Them Before Us to decide whether or not we should encourage some form of family creation. And that is, who's doing the hard thing? Are the adults doing hard things for kids? Or are the kids doing hard things for adults? So, what you see in the majority of no fault divorce cases, for example, and that's about 70% of divorces. There are some times where divorce might be necessary, but that's, for adultery or abuse or abandonment or addiction. But the majority of divorces end these days in low conflict marriages where there isn't somebody that is at fault. And so in those situations, you have to look at who's doing the hard thing here. Well, in no fault divorce cases, it's really saying, hey, kids, we want you to do the hard thing of living in two different homes with two different lives, 50% of the time developing two different personalities, because we, the adults, don't want to do the hard thing of growing, adjusting, holding ourselves accountable, going to therapy, going to counseling, changing, being transformed so that you can have the parents living together in a married, loving relationship that you deserve. So when you look at adoption versus surrogacy, you see very clearly that in one situation, the adults are doing hard things on behalf of the children. That's adoption. But in surrogacy, what you see is children doing hard things on behalf of adults. That's the world of big fertility. So, what are the hard things that are being done? Well, before I was a mom, I actually worked at the largest Chinese adoption agency in the world. And it was very clear. My director made it very clear that we are not here to give every adult a child. We are here to ensure that every child that needs parents is placed in a loving home. That means that the adults have to do hard things to be worthy of having a child placed with them. They have to go through screenings and background checks and home studies and references, trainings. And then once the child is placed with them, post-placement reports to monitor how the child is doing. Adults do hard things to prove that they are going to love and commit to a child as if the child had been born to them. The child also had to do a hard thing in terms of losing their mother or father. But adoption does not inflict that loss. Adoption simply seeks to mend that loss. When you look at surrogacy, From the children's rights perspective, you see the exact opposite. The child does lose always their birth mother, very often a genetic mother, and sometimes they go home to a world where there's no mother at all. Sometimes the child loses their father too. That's the thing about big fertility. Once you're making a baby in a petri dish, it doesn't matter if you're using the gametes of the child's biological mother or father. You can just buy both of them off of sperm and egg donor catalogs, mix them together, put them in somebody's womb, and take home a completely unrelated child. But there's no screening and background checks. And we already have documented cases of child predators that have gone the route of surrogacy who never would have been approved to adopt a child. I wrote an article about that in the Federalist a couple months ago, 5 child predators who acquired children through surrogacy, I think is what it was called. But here's the deal. In surrogacy, the adult is insisting that the child sacrifice for them, lose their genetic mother and or father, lose a connection with their birth mother, go home with adults who are very often, well, always unvetted and sometimes may be dangerous for them. And the child's completely unknown to social workers. I mean, honestly, we don't treat kidneys this way when you're talking about like a medical procedure to track a kidney going from one patient to another. But that's the nature of big fertility. Unlike adoption, that has had decades of development of best practice around elevating the best interest of the child, big fertility is just a marketplace centered around the desires of adults, and kids are the ones that have to pay the price.
Yeah, yeah. You talk about the idea of a this check clearing analogy. What was that about? Can you say
Well,
that
just
for us?
yeah, just that adoption. In adoption, the adults have to clear all kinds of screening and background checks, including like fingerprinting. In big fertility, there's no such vetting. The only check that clears is the check at the bank. It doesn't matter if you have a
Mm,
criminal record. It does not matter if you have a history of child pornography. It doesn't matter if you have made statements that you intend to abuse your surrogate born child. Generally, nobody's looking. Sometimes we discover that kind of thing by accident, but the fertility clinics are not looking at that in advance. They just want to know if you have the money to buy the baby.
mm. Yeah, and that brings us into kind of one of our other problems with it. This idea that it's child trafficking. Now, when I first heard that, I thought that's the most bizarre thing I've ever heard in my life. Child trafficking, isn't that, you know, chaining up kids in some, war-torn country somewhere? What does that mean that this is child trafficking? Can you just kind of briefly tell us that?
Well, trafficking is anytime that you are, well, human trafficking is anytime you are exchanging money for a human being temporarily, permanently. You are trafficking in an individual when you are buying and selling them. So this was actually a really important bright red line in adoption, because there are situations where adoption can um, skew towards what the adults want. Honestly, and it's too bad. We've seen it in domestic adoption. We've certainly seen it in some international adoptions where there can be maybe coercion of the birth mother to relinquish her child, sometimes through financial gifts, maybe just through pressure. But if money was going directly from intended parents to the birth mother or the intended parents to the genetic family, it was no longer an adoption. It was trafficking. That is considered baby buying and baby selling. In adoption, adoptive parents, like some of your listeners, like my husband and I, we paid a lot of money during our adoption process. None of it went to our adopted child's biological family. All of it went to 4 different authorities to determine that we were fit to bring him into our home. If any of our money had gone to his genetic parents or to his birth mother, it was no longer adoption. It was baby buying. That is prohibited in adoption. Big
Mm,
fertility, on the other hand, is built upon direct payments to genetic parents and to birth parents. When you purchase sperm or egg from a donor catalog, what are you purchasing? You are purchasing the genetic components. You are purchasing, in essence, the child's mother and father. And then you're paying that mother and father to stay out of their life forever. You are paying them to say, I relinquish my parental rights to this child. You are paying them to hand over their genetic child to you. And it is the same thing with surrogacy, that the child can actually be the full genetic child of the surrogate mother. It can be her egg and her womb, and money is going directly to her. But if the surrogacy contract is signed prior to conception, it's family building. So it's just obscene,
mm,
honestly, the way that they have contorted the lack of regulation to position themselves to, in essence, create a marketplace of children in complete violation of adoption best practice. It is categorically trafficking of children.
Yeah, well, it's not the only thing they twist. I would say they also twist language in order to uh, fluff up a lot of the less, shall we say, ethical aspects of their industry. I'd like to read some quotes just to kind of get your reaction and talk about this. This is from an article on WebMD talking about selective reduction, aka abortion. Quote: it is a surgery called multifetal reduction, which lowers the number of fetuses. End quote. And then later in the article, they say, quote, afterward, your doctor will do another ultrasound to check on the rest of your babies. End quote. Same
Mm.
article. 1 minute we're lowering the number of fetuses, and the next one it's babies. Imagine someone saying, "Oh, there was a mass killing somewhere, or whatever," and they lowered the number of people in the room.
Mhm.
What? How clinical? How bizarre? And yet, this is the sort of eugenic aspect of this. Oh, we don't want a boy, we don't want a girl, we don't want this. Could you tell us real quick? You've mentioned some stories, just some brief overview of some stories about suits over people, quote unquote, getting the wrong product, aka
Well,
child.
yeah, exactly. And that illustrates that this really is a marketplace. And
Yes.
surrogacy, especially, is going to, if you look at surrogacy contracts, I've looked at a few, other people have looked at many more than me. Selective reduction, which is abortion between 12 and 20 weeks, is standard language in surrogacy contracts. Why is that? It's because when you're paying six figures for a child, selective reduction or abortion functions as both quality control and quantity control. If the baby's not developing the way that you want and you have paid $150,000 for this baby, you want the ability to cancel your order. That's really what that is. Or if too many babies take because maybe they've implanted two and one of them has twinned. And now you've got a surrogate who, I mean, twin pregnancy is a high risk pregnancy anyway. An IVF pregnancy on its own is a high risk pregnancy. A surrogacy pregnancy, in addition, is a higher risk pregnancy. And then you've got triplets as well. I mean, you've got like risk upon risk upon risk. And so oftentimes the commissioning parents will say, oh, we don't want three kids, and B, it might jeopardize the survival of the two that we do want. And so they will selectively reduce. They'll use abortion to decrease the number of fetuses. Notice they're fetuses before the procedure, but babies afterwards. And so selective reduction is actually a pretty important tool for big fertility, just to make sure that they're able to get the commissioning parents order exactly right. And
So
there are,
actually,
go
really
ahead.
quick, kind of going into what people will sometimes say is they'll say, well, what about, a best case scenario? We have a wonderful Christian couple, they're conservative, they don't want to kill any babies, they don't want to do any of that. That's totally off uh, off for them. They're not going to do that. This is kind of called a best case scenario. But you've said before that um, the surrogacy and IVF industry is not invested in implanting all of the embryos or doing them one at a time. Why is that?
I know people who have gone into IVF with a pro-life mindset saying, we are not going to destroy any embryos. We are going to implant every single embryo that we create. Some have even said we're not going to freeze them, but most people don't have the money for that. It is so expensive. Every time you create embryos, you're talking like $15,000 to $20,000 if you're only creating two, and then those two fail because it's very high failure rates. Then you have to go back and do another $15,000, $20,000 every time you need to create more embryos. Much, much easier to create 15 to 20 embryos for that $15,000 to $20,000. Select the 10 that are the most viable, and then keep, 3 girls and 3 boys, and then donate the other 4 to research. Implant 1 girl and 1 boy and store the other 4 on ice. And so that's really sort of the standard practice for IVF. For people that go into it saying, I'm not going to do that, I have the money so that I can just always create the number of embryos I intend to implant fresh. And I'm not going to screen any of them. And I'm not going to deselect them because they're the wrong sex or have the wrong hair color or something, which is pretty routine with IVF. Even those people end up fighting their own doctors. The fertility clinics do not want you to do that because your success rates will be lower. And one of the very few things in this wild west of big fertility that they do need to track is their success rates. So you conducting your IVF cycle in a way that is pro-life is going to be bad for them. So you will argue against your own doctor if you would like to go into this process with a pro-life mindset.
Interesting. Yeah. And you've talked before, coming back to the idea of the eugenics behind it. There have been suits by gay couples and other couples too, suing over getting the wrong sex.
Yeah.
Or you mentioned one time a woman who was a surrogate, but she got cancer and she wanted chemo, and she wanted to deliver the baby prematurely to get that out of the way, but a couple that was using her as a surrogate said, "No, we don't want our some of our DNA out there. We don't want anybody else to have our kid. We would rather have the child die." And it
Mhm.
just kind of shows you how they commodify
Yeah.
human beings. And it's not just the children, it's even sort of the women too. We see women kind of being used as incubators in a certain sense. And in a certain sense, that is what their wombs are for. But it is so clinical, it's so separated from what it's supposed to be. And so that's a concern that a lot of people have, but some will press back and they'll say things like, "Well, hold on though. You say surrogates are, oh, they're being used, they're being tricked. Oh no." But aren't they consenting? Isn't everybody consenting in this relationship, Katie? I mean, what's the big deal if everybody consents?
So, surrogacy has largely been banned across Europe based on the exploitation of women argument. Because, yeah, a lot of times you've got the genetic mother who is the egg donor, and the birth mother who is the surrogate, and the commissioning mother who's the social mother and is going to take the child home. Oftentimes, all of them consent. And I would say it's very obvious that there is a economic imbalance, like in surrogacy, as Jennifer Law often says, the rich buy and the poor sell. But to me, you still have all the women consenting, and very, very often at the end of this process, all the women are happy. The egg seller, paid off some school loans. The surrogate made a little bit of money while her husband was deployed, and the intentional mother got to keep her bikini body and did not have to step away from her high powered job. And so like when we testify against commercial surrogacy in, different states, very often you see incredibly happy women at every stage of this process saying, "I love this. Why are you stopping this?" So I personally don't think that the commodification of women argument is very powerful because very often all the women really like it. There is a problem though. There is one party that does not consent and would not consent and cannot consent to the process of surrogacy. And just to be clear, what surrogacy is the splicing of what should be one person, mother, into three purchasable and optional women: the genetic mother who gives the children her biological identity, the birth mother with whom the child forms that critical bond in the first 9.5 months of their life, and the social mother who loves and raises the child and offers that distinctly female nurture that a man could never give the baby. And the child needs all three. And if all three are not found in one woman, the child will experience loss. A child would never consent to losing their genetic mother. A child would never consent to being severed from the only person they know the day they're born. A child would never consent to being raised in a motherless home. So, the only argument I think against surrogacy that is defensible in every case is the position that this is a victimizing child practice. This violates children's rights, their right to their mother and father. So I think that this is a matter of child defense. Surrogacy,
Mm.
whether or not the people that take home the baby are single or married or gay or straight or fertile or infertile, always forces children to lose one, two, or three mothers that they have a natural right to, that they long for, and that they need.
Yeah, and you talk about that bond, which is another aspect of trouble in this whole discussion, which is, like you said, severing a bond. But
Mhm.
some people will argue, they'll say, well, isn't it really okay that, these children are losing this bond? Isn't this bond really kind of just a fantasy in your head, Katie? I mean, the nuclear family, after all, is just a dangerous tool of white supremacy and heteronormativity, and it's really just a social construction. You can mix, you can match. How is a kid ever going to even know if you never tell them? What's the big deal?
Yeah, you can mix, you can match, but it's going to involve child loss. And that's where I draw the line. I mean, all of these euphemisms that we have, like if the adults are happy, the kids will be happy, or love makes a family. No, no, loss makes that family. Child has to lose their mother or father to be in your family, and that's an injustice. And you know what? Our species is heteronormative. I mean, like if you've got a problem with children coming from a man and woman and needing that man and woman and having optimal outcomes when raised by that married man and woman, your problem isn't with me. Your problem is with biology. This species is screaming against you and your designs for a modern family. And now, at them before us, we have the stories of kids that were raised in those modern families. And many of them say, yeah, that wasn't great. In fact, the Washington Post just had an opinion article out on Mother's Day of a gay dad who was talking about his 3.5-year-old daughter that came home from preschool and said, I want a mommy. 3.5 years old. This is a kid who is growing up in a very pro-gay, progressive, economically affluent area. There are zero people in her life saying, you know what, you should have a mommy. I guarantee every single one of them are saying, you're so lucky to have two dads who love you, two dads who wanted you so much. They went through so much trouble to have you. But you know what? This 3.5-year-old wanted a mom. Why? Because she's a human child, and that's what human children want. They want their own mother. She didn't have any social programming that said, you should have a mom. She just said, I desperately want a mom, and was sad for a couple weeks. And then she solved the problem herself by saying, one of my dads is going to be my mom. And now she calls him mom and literally polices everybody's pronouns and says, don't call him he, call my mom she. I mean, that's how innate it is. That's how ingrained it is in the reality of what it means to be a human child. And so like we can play with words. Supreme Court justices can make decisions about the entire nation and the nature of marriage, but you can't overwrite the fundamentals of what it means to be children, who they come from, what they need and what they want. I mean, you can try, but like biology's running the table here, not me.
Yeah, that's an important point, and it kind of goes to show you, again, there's no amount of defining something a different way that's ever going to change reality, and when we do that, we end up with terror, destruction, heartbreak, and loss in the wake. It's trying to sort of bully your way to a new reality that simply will never be, and sometimes people don't even realize it. They're not trying to be. Destructive, but that's what it ends up being. And that's kind of where we get the sort of distinction between natural law and our written law. You can write anything down, but naturally, the law of the jungle, as they say, is, again, mommy and daddy make a child. And uh, we are kind of spinning this out of control, thinking we can, as the old phrase goes, play God. But
Yeah.
that's just simply not what we do or what we're supposed to do. And so I guess our last little segment here relates to the kind of the topic you were just speaking on, the promotion of disordered family relationships. And we see this in pop culture all over. I remember watching the show Parks and Rec. There's a character who wants to get a child, but not have a dad in the picture. She just wants to go through IVF, and this is in popular culture. We see homosexual couples and single mothers trying to obtain children, which um, this has been, like I said, popularized and as you kind of talked about and I talked about, it starts to go against some factors of natural law. But you've also spoken on this idea of like a non-biological parent's danger and the mother's boyfriend concept. Could you just briefly tell us what that mother's boyfriend thing is? What is that?
Yeah, we talk at them before us a lot about the importance of biology in the parent-child relationship because we have worked so hard to minimize the importance of biology a lot, because we're trying to normalize non-traditional families. And if you want to normalize a non-traditional family, single parent, same-sex couples, thruples, which are kind of on the horizon. If you want to make way for blended families or step families because you want to exit your original marriage because whatever, you're not emotionally fulfilled, or I'm not sure, but you have to minimize the importance of biology so you can get these non-traditional families. But when it comes to child rights and well-being, biology is critical. First, because biological parents grant children their biological identity, which helps with identity formation. But next, because statistically, and we've got reams of data on this, biological parents are the safest, most connected to, most protective of, and most invested in children. And the presence of an unrelated adult, whether it is a stepmother or dad's live-in girlfriend or a stepfather, or especially mother's live-in boyfriend, drastically increases risks of abuse and neglect. And even if it's not direct abuse and neglect, it just rates of childhood accidents skyrocket because unrelated adults are not as attentive to what's going on with kids. So, a lot of people push back on me when I talk about how important it is for biological parents to raise their children together. And they say, well, that's ridiculous because kids just need to be safe and loved. They don't need biological parents. And I say, oh, I totally agree. Kids need to be safe and loved. That's why they need their biological parents. And they'll say, well, that's ridiculous. If the adults are happy, the kids will be happy. And I say, well, we actually have lots of data on what leads to child thriving. And almost universally, unless you're studying same-sex parenting, sociologists agree that it is the biological married relationship that leads to child thriving. And then I say, look, if the adults are happy, the kids will be happy. If love makes a family, if any two will do, because there's now books out saying, well, it's a two-parent home that you need, not a mother-father home, not biology, but a two-parent home is the most important thing. Well, if all those things are true, then children who are being raised by their mother and her cohabiting boyfriend would be doing great because the adults are happy. There's two parents, and they even have a mother and father figure. But those kids are not doing well. And I often tell people, just pause this video and Google the words mother's boyfriend and tell me what you find. And now you've come back and you've spent a few minutes drinking in some of the most jarring, disturbing headlines about child murder and child abuse and child torture that you're going to find anywhere on the internet. Because it turns out that if you want children to be safe and loved, swapping in unrelated adults is the way to endanger them the most.
Yeah, and when I look it up, before I've even clicked enter, you get results, and I'll kind of censor it for YouTube. But mother's boyfriend deletes child, shoots son, deletes daughter, deletes her son, abusing child statistics, arrested, kills 3-year-old. Right? I mean, this you haven't even clicked enter, and you've already been met with a barrage of just horrifying stories. And I can certainly assure you, when you do click enter, uh, don't go to images, don't go to any of that stuff. It's just vile. And that's the problem when we start mixing things up in a way that they're not supposed to. And it turns out all of these people who were promoting the traditional way of life, who were all these they're just prudes, and they're just religious fanatics. Turns out actually a lot of what they said actually seems like it's the most healthy.
Yep.
And we people will always go to the exceptions, but we saw recently as well with the American Society for Reproductive Medicine change the definition of infertility to include same-sex couples, so that they can get sort of a priority on waiting lists for even adopting kids. So it's even affecting sort of the adoption industry, at least
Oh,
in a
yeah.
certain extent. Um, and we've already talked about the natural law aspect of that, so we don't have to return to it. But I guess I'll just end with this last question, which I know you've been asked before, given the fact that, again, you don't favor gay couples adopting if they can have their biological mom and dad. But people will ask, would you rather have a child in an abusive heterosexual home or a loving gay home?
Mhm.
What is your response to that?
Well, I would just say that obviously I get asked this question a lot. And it's a very common tactic, honestly, of people that are in favor of a progressive overhaul of society, because what they do is they take what's called edge cases, right? The very, very margins, the great exceptions to whatever it is that they're arguing against. And then they say they want to build an entire case around those edges. And so, what are the edges that they're appealing to here? Well, first, the edge case that biological parents are abusive. There are abusive biological parents. It's just a fraction of all child abuse. In fact, if you go to our website, thembeforeus.com, on the fact sheet, you can go to Biology Matters, and we will show you the rates of abuse for household structure based on the fourth national incident of child abuse. And you'll see it's this teeny little bar. And then every other kind of family form just increases in terms of emotional, sexual, and physical abuse. So you're appealing to, you're in essence saying, of this household unit, which is statistically the safest for kids, let's just pull out this teeny, teeny little fraction. What if they're abusive? Okay, they exist. And then they swing over to the other edge case where you've got one or two adults who are unrelated to the child. Now, especially two men who are statistically the most likely to abuse a child. Sociologist Brad Wilcox said the most dangerous place a child can find themselves in America today is in a home with an unrelated man left to care for the child himself. So, adoptive parents go through screening and vetting in an effort to mitigate those risks. Two men who are raising a child that have never gone through those kinds of background checks, by the numbers, are going to be incredibly risky for kids. So they've pulled out two edge cases, the edge case of the extremely abusive biological parents and the extremely loving unrelated adults. And they've said, pit those against each other. What do you want? Well, first I'd say, well, why don't you first agree with me that biology in general, especially two biological parents married together, are statistically the safest place for the child. And if they say, no, I'm not going to agree, then I'm like, okay, now you're not actually wanting to have an honest debate. You are just using this to try to shape society in a way that agrees with your political priors. But if they say, okay, yeah, I am talking about the edge cases, I am talking about the extreme exception of abusive biological parents and the extreme exception of hyper loving and committed unrelated parents. And I'd say, okay, now you've got a case to make, right? And I would say at that point, it's a question for a social worker. That's what social workers do. They have to make subjective decisions about when to remove a child from a home of an abusive family, and then who and when to place the child with adoptive parents. Um, Side note, I've been in, I've asked several court appointed special attorneys how many children that they have represented that were removed from the home of their married biological mother and father. And I get answers from like 0 to 5%, with the normal around like 1 to 2%. So virtually all children that are removed from the home and sent into foster care, for example, come from homes where their mother and father are not there. So if you want to stop abuse, you will get on the them before us train and insist that all children are raised by their married biological mother and father. There's just no way around it. So don't try to come at me with these wild scenarios. Let's get right down to what we know about children based on biology, based on our decades of social science research, based on common sense, and let's form our personal decisions and our political decisions around those child realities.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you, Katie, for joining us and being so generous with your time. I would love to have you back on again. So we'll see. Maybe we'll, if this is received quite well, we'll have you back on and talk about some other topics as well. But yeah, just thank you for sharing with us. Your comments are invaluable, and I guess we'll let you go now. But before we do, tell us where people can find more of your work. People are interested in you. They say, I got to get more of this. What should they read? Where should they go? Tell us.
There's a lot happening. I would just say come to thembeforeus.com and subscribe. We always have new articles and interviews coming out. We're talking to so many different people. We've got incredible projects, including a $1 million documentary we're working on with Focus on the Family, a new book that's coming out in September that takes our entire children before adults philosophy and applies it to all of politics. An HR benefits package that will help you prioritize children in the corporate world, a church curriculum that illustrates why God's design for sex and marriage is plan A for child protection. So just come, subscribe, be connected to us, and like get in here and start defending kids with us, because kids need champions. And it's honestly, it's going to be you and me that does it.
Well, thank you, Katie. Hopefully we'll see you again, and thank you for joining us.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. All right, everybody. Well, I hope you enjoyed that interview, and I will recommend that you see more of my videos on these topics, as well as check out more of Katy Faust's work. It's great. She's got a book, Them Before Us. I highly recommend it. It's a guide on all of these sorts of questions that you might have if you have more. And of course, feel free to ask questions down below. Leave a comment. What do you have a question about what I think about IVF, what I think about surrogacy, what I think about abortion, and these sorts of topics? Comment it down below. If you disagree, make sure you comment that. Let us know what you think. Did any of these things we talked about today change your worldview or make you think differently about it? So on my channel, we talk about pro-life arguments as well as arguments for Christianity. So if any of that interests you, make sure you subscribe, and we will catch you next time. Thank you so much for tuning in, and may God bless you all. Bye-bye.